So George Soros is he's Hungarian. He was born in the 1930s and lived through Nazi occupation in Hungary, and then his family fled to the States to get away from that. And then he became a wildly successful banker and financier and manager of a hedge fund. Really famously, for the UK, he was quote unquote the man who broke the Bank of England. He shorted the British pound in the 90s and made a huge amount of money off of that, along with a bunch of other financial funds who saw that happening. And that was part of the reason for, I think, Britain crashing out of the European, um, what is it, the European Economic group, the European Research. I can't remember exactly what the ERG, but they crashed out, and then Britain had to rebuild its economy after that. And that's I think, one of the reasons that the British pound is still, or was still in use when it was in the EU, rather than using the euro itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously, I think he's particularly well known for being a philanthropist, and as you say, he's made a
Yes.
lot of money
Yeah.
through the financial markets. Probably most famous for founding the Open Societies Foundation. So, can you explain a wee bit about what that is and the kind of politics that Soros promotes?
Yeah, absolutely. So like he did get his start as a financier, and then he pledged a lot of his wealth to this foundation that he created, the Open Society Foundation. The name of it comes from a book by Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, called The Open Society and Its Enemies. The basic argument in that book is that open societies tolerate lots of different kinds of ideologies. In Karl Popper's case, he's specifically talking about like communism, fascism, different kinds of both left and right wing ideologies that
Mm.
all uh, combine in an open society that tolerates all of these different ideas. And so Soros was really influenced by that, and he was really influenced by just his childhood of growing up in an authoritarian fascist country. And so in the 70s, he founded the Open Society Foundation to give away a lot of his wealth and invest in a lot of different kinds of civil society organizations that promote any sort of open society. So it's like some of the main areas that they invest in is like equity, in social justice causes, in like arts and culture
Mm.
as well as like human rights initiatives all across the world. So his foundation has been like very active in promoting. The endowment is something like $20 billion something. So it is. I mean, it's a huge foundation. It does have a lot of money, and they do quite a lot of investing, and really all around the world, in the U.S., in Africa, in Europe. Um, uh, a lot of the money, especially what was going to like Eastern Europe to try and counter some of the authoritarian societies like that were emerging from the wake of the 20th century. So that's the kinds of things that interests um, the board there.
Yeah. I mean, you're kind of explaining it a little bit, I suppose, in that previous answer, but he has become quite a sort of bogeyman for the right wing in the US and across the world, but also just kind of conspiracy theorists in general. Um, why do you think his name and his foundation has become such a like repeated name within these conspiracies and within these narratives that are being created?
Well, there's a couple of different reasons for that, I think. Um, there's so I think at large it's like, if you have like any sort of like financier or philanthropist or who's donating to their own ideological causes, I think it's a pretty like normal and fair thing to say like we can criticize that person for how they choose to invest their money. So like I do
Yeah.
want to say like up front there is like a fair and an unfair way of doing this.
Hmm.
So I think first of all, because of the things that he chooses to invest in, a lot of things are promoting liberal democracies, promoting open dialogue, and specifically promoting like equity initiatives that I can understand why some people on the right wing, or even on the more left version, left side of things, have completely legitimate criticisms of that. But then also those criticisms often delve into anti-Semitic stereotypes because he is a wealthy Jewish banker
Yeah.
promoting international causes. And we all know what happened the last time that somebody made that the face of their propaganda efforts. So there's that as well. But so some of the reasons that people have started criticizing him is because he is uh, an extremely influential donor, and a lot of his activities in uh, Eastern Europe and the developing world have attracted a lot of criticism from authoritarian governments. Um, I think the earliest criticism of him was from a Malaysian prime minister in the 90s who
Yeah.
said that he'd intentionally shorted the ringgit and caused the economy to collapse. The Malaysian prime minister did apologize for that years
Mm.
later to George Soros, but like that's kind of where we get the start of those tropes. And then, those criticisms can range from more or less legitimate to more or less conspiratorial as we go.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think is interesting that you mentioned there is, as you say, there's sort of two sides to it, because there is a legitimate criticism of his type of philanthropy and because he does have. I mean, if you're a very very wealthy man who donates to causes you support, may they be social justice causes, may they be causes you agree with or not, he does have an outsized influence, then, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in that sense, he could be comparable. The Americans, for instance, talk a lot. Americans on the left talk about the Koch network, the Charles and David Koch, who are
Yeah.
fossil fuel billionaires who invest
Yeah.
in a lot of conservative, dark money causes to promote all sorts of different right wing things. And so, like, some of those criticisms could be like compared to that. In that sense, what was the question again? Sorry.
Only that I was. Yeah, I mean, you're only that he does have an outsized influence. I think that's where
Yeah,
a lot of
and I
people
think the
think.
reason he has an outsized influence is because he's, super rich.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in that though. Do you think that he is similarly opaque in the way that he funds things as the Kochs are? Is that a fair comparison, or
No, that's I think where something strongly differs. There are a lot of conservative groups in the U.S., especially that deliberately occlude where the money is being spent. They don't
yeah,
disclose their donors,
Mm.
and they don't make it publicly known how they spend their money necessarily. Whereas when it comes to the Open Society Foundation and how it spends its money, they're like very transparent and very upfront about how much money they have, where all that money came from, and how they decide to distribute that money. And then most of the time, like, I can't say for certain like what conditions that money comes from
Mm.
all the time, but like they are choosing to donate to organizations, and then those organizations do have a degree of independence in how they use that money. So it's not it's not so straightforward. It's a lot more open and a lot more transparent in that sense, and that's just the legitimate use of money in a democratic capitalist society. That's how people can choose to do it, and as long as it's all out in the open, you know, that seems fair.
Yeah.
okay? And you sort of mentioned earlier that Soros was born in the 1930s, so he
Mhm.
is now a very old man. I think he's in his 90s, if my
Yeah,
maths is correct.
yeah, yeah.
So, and he's also been a prominent figure, as you said, for a number of years now. Dating back to the financial crisis in the UK in the 1990s. So, do conspiracy theories about him predate the internet, or has that sort of supercharged them? Would you say?
That's a bit of a tricky question because, like I said, there are about George Soros specifically. I could not find conspiracy theories necessarily about him that stretched back so far. I think that
Mm.
there was um, perhaps some negative coverage of him in his home country of Hungary
Okay.
years ago. Like I said earlier, there was that sort of like more conspiratorial claim in the 90s from the Malaysian government, but the things that stretch back a lot further are the anti Semitic tropes and stereotypes that his activities have been used to invoke. And specifically, those anti-Semitic stereotypes are the Jewish person as the perpetual outsider, the wanderer, the the person who has all of the money and is pulling the strings. A lot of these anti-Semitic tropes are centuries old from
Yeah.
Europe. The idea of Jews as moneylenders or as
Hmm.
trying to corrupt Christian society. And then some of them are only about 100 years old. For instance, Jewish people as a cabal of financiers trying to control the world for a quote unquote globalist agenda. That dates back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which, if your
Yeah.
listeners are not familiar, is um, a document, a piece of propaganda that was produced under the Russian Tsar in the 1920s, I think, that purported to be the minutes of a meeting of a cabal of Jewish elders about how they were going to take over the world. And that became the basis of Nazi propaganda and was widely distributed in the US as well. So that sort of like conspiratorial framework is the thing that harkens back to a lot of what the anti-Semitic criticism of George Soros dips into. And while a lot of that does emanate from the right, some of it again does come from the extreme left. Um, and those, and then beyond the internet, there are like, I do want to emphasize that it's not just anti-Semitic conspiracies or conspiracy theories about George Soros that are proliferated on the internet. They are proliferated by state governments and state media in a variety of different countries, including Hungary, Pakistan, Turkey, and especially in the US, not state media, but definitely like huge media channels on TV in the US and the UK.
Yeah, well, I think that's where we were going to come to, because this, I mean, part of the reason we're talking about Soros now, although, as you say, the conspiracy theories about him have been going for a long time, is that he's been recently drawn into the prosecution of Donald Trump. Trump and other Republicans have certainly mentioned that the prosecutor Alvin Bragg was funded by Soros, or I mean, Republican Matt Gaetz said that there was a quote Sorosification of the justice system, and we know that this sort of invoking Soros is something that the current Republican, like Trump's Republican Party or people that are support Trump, have done regularly. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, a little bit about how that came about, and
Yeah,
also the links between these things.
yeah. So the idea of Soros as a puppet master in the American right date back a couple of years. It didn't used to be a really mainstream thing that was more
Hmm.
common in like very conspiratorial circles, and now it's been mainstreamed. A huge
Yeah,
part of that was the U.S. Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson, who has the most watched cable news show in the United States. It's
Hmm.
tens of millions of
yeah,
people. Um, he made a documentary about Hungary, where he traveled to Hungary and spoke to Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who is a deeply illiberal, authoritarian politician who's like shut down opposition media, gone after opposition politicians um, legally, and like rolled out a whole host of anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ policies.
yeah,
And so Tucker Carlson made this documentary about Hungary and Orban portraying it as this outpost of civilization, outpost of Western civilization in Eastern Europe specifically, where he really softballed the interview with Orban. And Viktor Orban speaks specifically about how he made George Soros the face of the opposition. He said, "This is what
right,
we're fighting. We're fighting foreign influence. We're fighting globalist influence. We're fighting," and he doesn't often say Jewish influence, but
right,
the dog whistles are extremely clear that this is what it's supposed to mean. A lot of the attack imagery of George Soros in Hungary uses these like very anti-Semitic stereotypes including the puppet master thing, as well as the stereotype of the, quote, laughing Jew, like they're laughing at you and taking control of your stuff. Or like that Soros is funding immigrant caravans into the country and trying to destroy pure white Hungarian civilization with Muslims from the Balkans and Turkey and further afield. So Tucker Carlson makes this documentary, which contains all of these like extremely dangerous stereotypes and misinformation about George Soros, and that gets circulated throughout the American right and through American TV pundits. So that gets picked up, and now Soros is a bit of a talking point on Fox News and on other less organized channels. So like other commentators like frequently comment about Soros this and Soros that. And in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests in the US, especially in 2020, there were calls to defund the police. The criticism being that the police were a racist institution who perpetuated violence against Black and brown people at disproportionate rates. And there were a lot of, there's been a bit of move in the American justice system to try and get prosecutors who are working within the system to try and create safer, more just places that aren't so punitive. Now, George Soros directly supports that effort. He's written an editorial in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago that explains he's like, I support reform prosecution. Because, and his logic is that fairer societies are not just more just; they are also more safe. That's his basic argument.
Okay.
And people can, agree or disagree with his methods or tactics or reasons for, doing that. However, but that, he's laid that out and made that very clear about what he's doing. And he has funded a number of organizations that support these, a lot of prosecutors who are like run for public office and who try and get in those prosecutorial seats. So one of the groups that he's donated about $1 million to is Color for Change in New York. And they endorsed Alvin Bragg, his candidacy, and Alvin Bragg got in. And so it is true that Soros, his Open Society Foundation, has given money to organizations that support this kind of thing and support people like Alvin Bragg. It is not true that Soros or anyone at the Open Society Foundation had any say into who those people are specifically.
Isn't that this is quite often what we find, and I think this is such an interesting thing to note, because I think we as journalists, we get it, any group get it, that if there's any link between a foundation and something which funded someone, these like 4 chains away of funding or something, or some bit of money that gone somewhere, then it's linked as if it's some sort of direct control from the person that's at the other end of it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. It's just kind of a soup. It's linking by free association. Like there, when somebody says like this person funds that thing, it is a completely reasonable and understandable to critique, to say like, okay, follow the money. Where does that go? Yeah, totally. Who benefits? Who is this for? Why are they funding things? In this case, however, this is not like a secret, as we were discussing before. This is a completely open and transparent chain of funding. Soros was explicit about why he supports these kind of causes. The Open Society Foundation discloses to whom and how much money they give. The organization that takes the money explains how it spends the money and explains like how much independence or dependence it has on its funders. And then Alvin Bragg is also, by the way, his own person. He has his own motivations and his own reasons for doing things. So like to say like George Soros supports these causes and has funded these causes, completely fair. To say that George Soros controls Alvin Bragg or controls the reform prosecutors about the country, that's an anti-Semitic caricature. Okay, for sure.
And just to explain a wee bit, because I'm not sure a Scottish audience would completely understand the concept of electing prosecutors, presumably that there's also examples of prosecutors in the US who have received funding from right-wing donors as well.
Yes. So I think the most obvious comparison that I can draw here is the Federalist Society. And for those who might not know, the Federalist Society is a legal club that was founded in the 80s after a conservative justice, Robert Bork, was not allowed to join the Supreme Court. Basically, the Senate, he was very openly saying he had a lot of like extreme conservative leanings, and the Senate at the time was like, no, we actually will not confirm you to the Supreme Court. And so the Federalist Society was founded, kind of as a response to this, to deliberately shift the judiciary all the way to the right as much as it could. And so the Federalist Society as an institution has lots and lots of funding from lots of right-wing donors, and they have an enormous amount of money, and they work to promote that. As of now, there are 6 Federalist Society judges on the U.S. Supreme Court. All of the conservative ones have all been members of that, and there's an enormous amount of them on all of the lower courts as well.
Yeah.
This is because, again, this is how a democratic capitalist society works, is that people can choose to donate to the causes that matter most to them. And again, while it's fair to criticize Soros for the things that he invests in and for the causes he supports, it's also just as fair to criticize that. And a number of further right donors and further right funds that you have a choice of in the United States is much higher, I think, for instance. And just to come back to your other point, I know in the UK that it's a little unfamiliar to say electing a prosecutor, but it does vary state by state. Sometimes prosecutors are appointed, sometimes judges are appointed, and sometimes those are elected positions that are on the public ballot. And so that just depends on which state you're in.
Okay.
You mentioned George Soros conspiracies being a sort of anti-Semitic dog whistle. I'm interested to know, first of all, like if you could just explain that and how some people might be talking about George Soros and not knowing necessarily the history of it and the more anti-Semitic sides of the conspiracy theory, and also how it is interacting with other conspiracy theories that we've kind of seen doing the rounds.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the UK conspiracy space, especially, I think where the George Soros stuff got its start, especially with the anti-Semitic stuff, that came about especially with the Brexit campaign. The Daily Telegraph during the Brexit campaign had a big front page splashed exclusive saying, we've just received word that George Soros is funding the Brexit camp, or the anti-Brexit campaign. And he'd spent something like £400,000 on groups that are trying to campaign against Brexit. And the politicians that used that story, the journalists that printed it and talked about it, like a lot of them got criticism for being anti-Semitic because that was they were employing these same tropes of Soros, like controlling or being the puppet master of trying to promote a globalist agenda. So that's kind of where that got its start, especially in Britain, and the discourse of that followed the groundwork into the COVID conspiracy space and the 15-minute city stuff. Yeah. So like during COVID, the idea that George Soros is funding, along with like Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum, they're funding these initiatives to, combat climate change, combat pandemic readiness, to try and make societies a little bit more livable in the sense that they, in the ways that they think, including like the idea of the Great Reset. I'm sure your listeners have heard that.
Yeah, kind of listing a list of ones we've discussed already.
Yeah, for sure. So the Great Reset is an idea of like, this is how we want to reset society because the COVID-19 pandemic creates this unique opportunity to do that. That was Klaus Schwab's book about a post-COVID society. And a lot of the ideas in those conspiracy spaces about Klaus Schwab being a master manipulator. Klaus Schwab is also a Jewish banker, by the way.
Right.
Um, he gets targeted as being this master manipulator who's trying to like create a globalist society or whatever. And a lot of that is exactly tied into the same kind of discourse as George Soros. So as long as you can find any connection to either Klaus Schwab or George Soros, like we were talking about earlier with these sort of like he funds, them funds, whatever, like that in itself can be used as a conspiratorial proof of a master plan to crush the British people's sovereignty or whatever. And so that's often how it's used in that same sense. It's just you just have to find some tie to the Open Society Foundation or some tie to the World Economic Forum, and that's how those conspiracies like interplay in this space quite a lot. And I think to people who say that like, oh, is this anti-Semitic? Is this not anti-Semitic? Like, do we know that's anti-Semitic or not? I had a quote that I wanted to read from the American author Emily Tamkin, who's written a book about the George Soros myth and like what he is and how he has had this influence on politics, but also like what it's not. And this is her writing in the New Statesman. The bot politician, the corrupting influence of the outsider, these are anti-Semitic stereotypes. What's really being said, when these are happening? This is me paraphrasing, sorry. George Soros isn't running for office. What is the intent of saying that a person, yes, a Jewish person, not on the ballot, is controlling the candidate, and that they wish to degrade citizens and uplift violent criminals? And why, when the trope has repeatedly been identified as anti-Semitic and is putting Jewish people and others at risk, when mass shooters cite conspiracies about Jews controlling other populations in their manifestos, why would anyone persist in using it?